interesting. When I was talking, hinting at the Creature Commandos screeners that I got like a week or so ago on one of the live streams, and I said, it's a little vulgar, somebody said, isn't it just like the Harley Quinn animated series, which one could definitely describe also as vulgar. But I thought that was a very interesting question. And of course, James Gunn has guest starred on the Harley Quinn animated series himself. And I thought about it, and I think that my answer is that while they're definitely, I don't even know if I'd say cut from the same cloth, because the animation style is also very different, but I think they both have the same goal, but they actually end up being the antithesis of each other. And I think the best way to describe it is, if you watch the Harley Quinn series, the animated Harley Quinn show, and you're like, I don't really appreciate this, then Creature Commandos is probably something that you will appreciate, and vice versa. I love the Harley Quinn show, as many of you know, and so Creature Commandos is not really for me. However, I watched all the screeners because I wanted to review it, and I do have a couple of positive things to say about it. And also, some points that I want to make about, the new DCU and James Gunn at the helm. I think that there's very strong, clear through lines in James Gunn's work that I think has emerged. Although, particularly in I think you could loop his non-Marvel work, let's say, his non-Marvel work. So I'm interested to discuss it with you. All right, non-spoiler review. So where was I? Positive elements. All right, so I came to like the character of the bride very much. I also sort of liked the music. I mean, it's a little, well, I think it's all from one source, but it feels a little Guardians of the Galaxy once again in terms of like choosing very strong song choices over like a score. So let's say, although I think it also maybe has a score a little bit, but it was a lot when binging the show. Like I was like, I just can't take this intense polka anymore. But I did like the idea of the intense polka. I think week to week, it's probably going to play better. I know a lot of you really like the Peacemaker intro, which I do not care for, but I appreciate that so many of you like it. And I think you might this isn't as avant-garde as the Peacemaker intro, but it's fun. And also with the Suicide Squad Rick Flag versus Peacemaker sequence, that was a thing of beauty. G.I. Robot, interestingly enough, has some of the coolest and most interesting sequences in this show, with some deep cut Easter eggs and one aerial shot, which let's just say includes raining bullets. You will know it when you see it. That is truly beautiful. I was like, damn, that's a nice shot. It was very, very good. It was as good as when he had that cool reflection in the Peacemaker helmet. And you were like, oh, that was a very nice shot. Also, I think that after a rocky and quite frankly icky first few episodes, the mystery that's explored here is actually kind of interesting. I found myself somewhat intrigued. I was like, yeah, that's a pretty good mystery. That's how I felt when it was done. I was like, oh, that was pretty good. In regards to that mystery, though, speaking of deep cuts, but again, no spoilers, I got a bit of an education. This was interesting to me as to when and how, and sometimes why deep cuts do not work. I had not quite understood this because we've been having a lot of discussion about deep cuts. James Gunn is a big deep cut guy, and I've been like, deep cuts are too niche. But then at one point, the princess here, her chief of guard, is referred to as Amethyst Knight. And I was like, oh my God, is she Amethyst, Princess of Gemworld? She's not. That's why this is not a spoiler. But I like the fact that she might be. Oh my gosh, I got so excited. So here's the thing. If you're not familiar with Amethyst, Princess of Gemworld, she was created in the 1980s as sort of like DC's She-Ra, although she came out the year before She-Ra debuted. So it's like a little bit like, there are a couple of duplicates between DC and Marvel, and this is a duplicate between DC and Mattel. But the reason I'm familiar with the character is that a couple of years ago, you might recall this, DC tried to bring her back. And I picked up those comics, and while they were not particularly good, I thought the character was somewhat interesting. And I remembered her. So when I thought, I was like, that is a deep cut that I can respect. Oh my gosh. If she had been Amethyst Princess of Gemworld, let me tell you, my enjoyment of this series and my respect and appreciation for it as a comic book fan would have skyrocketed. So if you are like one of the few fans of a couple of the really, really niche deep cuts that are on this show, you might appreciate it more than I do. And so that was interesting to me. I was like, now I see the power of the deep cut. But the problem with the deep cut is that they're so deep that they only appeal to a minute number of people. You know, like how many of you would have been excited about Amethyst Princess of Gemworld, right? It would another scenario where I'm like the only person defending a show. And I'd be like, because it would be like when I said I liked Borderlands because of Joan Crawford. So it's like very similar, but I would have enjoyed the hell out of it. So I think that the issue is that James Gunn is making deep cut references that don't have broad appeal and also that don't appeal to me or else I'd be out there defending them more. And even when he picks good characters that I think have broader appeal and that I am interested in, we don't always agree on his interpretation of the character. I'm like, yes, that's the right character, but I don't like what you've done with them at all. Now, DC is a particularly fractured fan base, which really sucks. You know, it's the reason there's a DC curse and why everyone's having such a hard time in this IP. James Gunn included so far. So it would be impossible for all of us to be on the same page. But the name of the game with DC is trying to get the most people on the same page as possible. And we'll see if Gunn can do it. I don't think he's going to be able to do it with this show. I don't even know if he's trying to, but hopefully he'll be able to do it with Superman. And even some of the things that seem a little iffy out of the gate, maybe he'll win us over and we'll be like, I did end up liking this interpretation. So Creature Commandos is for James Gunn's diehard fans because it is exactly the same as Peacemaker and it's a direct spin-off of his Suicide Squad movie. To me, Creature Commandos highlights why it's not a good idea to have a creative talent as the business lead on a franchise. Side note, but I really think that Superman should have kicked off his new DCU, but it's not. And I don't like that logo, by the way. I intellectually appreciate the new DCU logo because it's, of course, early Superman, the first comic, the first superhero, although it seems Superman is no longer the first superhero either. But when it played in front of every episode of Creature Commandos, and it just didn't rev you up. It didn't get you excited like the Marvel intro does, or the one that DC had before. By the way, speaking of Harley Quinn, they always would score with a new piece of music, that intro, every time it played in front of one of their episodes, the old intro, and it was phenomenal. I talked about that. The composer actually reached out to me and said he was so happy that I noticed what they were doing and I appreciated it. And that to me is like great packaging. You couldn't even do that here because it's so short. It's such a short intro and it's a style of art that is not at all popular these days. So I really didn't like that intro. Again, I intellectually understand why they went with it, but just from a fun perspective, it's not effective. But yes, back to why having a creative talent as a business lead is a bad idea. Because nobody but James Gunn would have greenlit this animated series, and they certainly wouldn't have allowed it to kick off a new era for a franchise because it doesn't feel fresh or new. I think that DC fans, by the way, also like to think that DC stories are more sophisticated and darker than Marvel's. Like that's where DC thrives, which is why, I know some of you will say not every DC character, but those characters just haven't proven to be as popular as I think the more darker interpretations. And I think even with the lighter characters for the mainstream, people put DC, maybe like, can it break out of that box? And I guess that's a question we're going to find out, the answer to that question. But I think that's why Christopher Nolan, Zack Snyder for a little bit, and Matt Reeves have been so well received, and why a lot of us are more excited or most excited about the Lanterns HBO show that's coming up. Although to be fair, James Gunn put that together. I think that is the best example of him just being a producer and putting the project ahead of himself. It's a little, I don't want to, obviously, Jeff Johns was a whole nother problem, but Jeff Johns would only push his own comic book stories. And that was a real problem for DC as well. And I wish that more often James Gunn would not, want to have his own flair on everything. We'll see. For a project that's supposed to signal a new era, this is just so similar to Peacemaker and the Suicide Squad. And why is there more of this? Gunn's Suicide Squad movie wasn't even that successful. I know it came out during the pandemic, but it was very popular with his diehard fans and really not beyond that. It certainly did not capture the hearts and imaginations of casual fans and moviegoers. So why does it have 2 spin-offs? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. If James Gunn wanted to kick off his new DCU with a signature show, and I can understand that, then I would have preferred it just be Peacemaker Season 2 instead of this. Maybe it would get more people to watch Peacemaker Season 2 because they'd be like, well, let's see, this is the start. Let's try it. Also, there are 2 other issues I want to address about James Gunn before kind of moving past James Gunn to talk about the characters on the show, etc. But it's hard to separate the show from James Gunn because his DNA is infused in it. I mean, he really just kind of, it seems very strongly that he just made this show for himself. And if you want to watch it too, that's fine. I guess for himself and his diehard fans. But the reason I say for himself in particular is, so 2 things. So the first is that for the first few episodes, Creature Commandos plays sort of like a weird James Gunn Dear Penthouse fantasy. Like Flag Sr., who looks like James Gunn, we'll talk about that in a moment, gets together with the princess in a very graphic and extended way. And Gunn, by the way, has made such a big deal about casting Maria Bakalova, who he worked with on Guardians 3. He's made such a big deal that you would think this character was a big deal, but the character's not a big deal. She's only a big deal in this specific way. So you're just kind of like, it's just, again, I said kind of icky. And then as for Rick Flag Sr., why is he animated to look like a roided out James Gunn? And you might be like, well, that's just the character design, but it's not. That's why it's weird, because Frank Grillo is going on to play this character in 2 live action projects, Peacemaker Season 2 and James Gunn's Superman movie. But he doesn't look like this in either of those projects. So it's just so weird. And again, kind of icky that in the opening credits, there's an animated version of James Gunn, which is also kind of weird. All right. And you see that it's just like, again, it's like the roided version and the regular version, so it has that weird fantasy thing. Like, why are we watching this? Isn't this just for you? And on that note, I continue to feel that Gunn, some of you have asked me repeatedly, what is my exact issue with the way that Gunn, has stories with female characters, especially his non-Marvel work. And we've talked about specifics, but I tried to think of an overall issue. And I think that a good way to describe it is that Gunn, and I'm not saying he doesn't intentionally, I hope he doesn't, he normalizes toxic behavior towards women, normalizes it, excuses it. And that just does not feel right. The relationship between the bride and Frankenstein, for instance, also is extremely problematic. In fact, the bride's whole origin story is really, really a problem. It almost, I can't discuss it in detail because I don't want to give spoilers, but let's just say it could be played in human resources seminars as examples of gross abuse of power. And then, after her origin story, the Frankenstein situation continues to be extremely problematic. And it almost seems like Gunn is trying to humanize someone who is essentially a dangerous stalker. And I just don't understand. I mean, I guess there's no one to give him that note. Peter Safran, what are you doing over there? Even in a friendly manner, just privately being like, I don't know if you realize what you've done here, but this is what you've done. And so I think that, as a woman, that's one of the reasons that his work, his non-Marvel work, and even a little bit of his Marvel work has consistently made me uncomfortable. I do miss Joel Kinnaman's Rick Flag, a good man amongst monsters. And that's to Gunn's credit, by the way. He didn't come across that way in David Ayer's Suicide Squad. And that Flag's death in the Suicide Squad resonates still so profoundly. Again, that's very much to Gunn's credit. I mean, that scene is perhaps my all-time favorite of his DC work. I mean, it's just very, very impressive. Creature Commandos needs a Rick Flag-style leading man, and Frank Grillo as his father just is not a suitable replacement. Even John Cena, to his credit, has very strong leading man energy, which is why I think Peacemaker is better anchored than this show. And I think that's one of the reasons that I preferred the later episodes, because the bride, voiced by Indira Varma, really steps up and almost takes over the show. And I think she has very strong leading character energy. She's a great character. And with her large, athletic, but still very fashionable build, you know who she reminds me of? The monster version of Rebecca on Ted Lasso, played by Hannah Waddingham. So I love that character. So I was like, oh, look, it's the monster version. And she had some cool action sequences. I see real potential in the bride. It's nice to see Viola Davis back again as Amanda Waller, although I continue to feel that this depiction of Amanda Waller could have a little more kick. You know, it's just not enough, which Davis is certainly capable of delivering, which makes it all the more frustrating. For instance, she just did an excellent job as the villain in the last Hunger Games movie. I'm like, let Viola Davis loose. Let her really, let her rip with this character. And I'm a big David Harbour fan, which makes it all the more disappointing that he voices Frankenstein. I like David Harbour quite a bit, but like Gunn, maybe that's one of the reasons Gunn cast him, and they probably get along really well. I think they both have very bad judgment, very bad personal judgment. And I'm a little tired of Alan Tudyk. Sorry, he voices my favorite droid, K2SO. But he's not as although I hate his Clayface on Harley Quinn. He is not as versatile as some people seem to think that he is. I'm like, he can only do like 2 or 3 voices. Dr. Phosphorus is a great addition to the team, although I just kept thinking of Derek Powers, aka Blight from Batman Beyond, which is maybe why I like that character. I was like, oh, let's get some Batman Beyond in here. Also, with a team, Dr. Phosphorus ended up being extremely helpful. He was very useful. I was like, I love in team scenarios, X-Men fans know what I'm talking about, that certain power sets end up being surprisingly helpful across the board. And you're like, oh, what a great member of the team. And Dr. Phosphorus very much was that here. Also, Clayface, I'm glad it was a different version of Clayface from the Harley Quinn show. But I wish they hadn't revealed that he was even in this show, that character, because it was such a great surprise when I was watching my screeners. I was like, come on, don't talk about that. But it was cool. As I said, G.I. Robot has some of the most interesting and complex storylines and action sequences. But again, I think I've noticed a trend with James Gunn's work. Again, especially his non-Marvel work. And that's that he has a through line in a project about how this one thing that everyone can agree is awful. In this case, Nazis. But it's somehow supposed to excuse the icky, more subversive, problematic elements peppered throughout the rest of the project. You're like, yes, that is awful, but what about all these other awful things that you have in here that are, in fact, even a little bit more insidious because they're kind of snuck in there? But it seems to work with some people. All right, so to me, Creature Commandos is for hardcore James Gunn fans. I don't totally understand you. Some of you might be like, wait, it's just more of the same. But, if you like it, you like it. And also, I think people who still think DC animated movies are good will enjoy it. Oh, I went there. It's so sad what happened to DC animation. All right, so anyway, it's okay, I think, for other DC fans, like myself, if you can get through the first few episodes, you'll appreciate it, I much prefer the Harley Quinn animated series and even the recent Batman Caped Crusader, which was far from perfect, but so beautifully atmospheric, especially as a film noir fan. I really liked that a lot. But I was able, as I said, to watch all these episodes, and I found some elements to be interesting and pretty good, and I was intrigued by the mystery. And there are a decent amount of Easter eggs. I mean, none of that are particularly exciting. They don't really seem to go anywhere. But if you're a DC fan, you'll be like, oh yeah, I see it. I see what you did there. So, I'm not like, oh, like Amethyst Princess of Gemworld. I didn't even like the comic again, but for some reason, that would have really leveled this show up to an amazing degree. All right, so that's what kind of deep cut would you get really excited about? Like, what's a deep cut that only you would be excited about? All right, so that's my review of Creature Commandos, starting on Max, not HBO. This is just a Max show. HBO is like, We just can't take it anymore. All right, so it starts this Thursday with the first 2 episodes are dropping, so you'll get a lot of the ick out of the way right away, and then goes to a weekly release schedule through January 9th. So we'll see what everyone thinks. All right, share your thoughts down below, subscribe today, and of course, as always, you can check out some more videos right now.